Uh, Hello. So we have been talking about a lot of ends and objectives regarding EU African Union relations, EU-Africa relations for the last 3 sessions. And then we have to deal with the means. So that is what this last session is about. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Iliana Olivié. I'm Senior Analyst at Elcano Royal Institute. And well, I have the opportunity to co-author the briefing note for this session with my colleague Maria Santillanoshi, who is just there, and also with Sam Bilal from the CTPM, who unfortunately cannot be with us this afternoon. The title of this session is how to mobilize more and better development finance in times of scarcity. And actually, I mean, this, of course, is framed in the particular context of the post-pandemic and post-Ukraine scene. But this is a question that has been asked in development in the development community for decades now, and maybe dating back to the Monterey Consensus in the early 2000s. So a long-lasting question in a context which is increasingly complex with challenges piling up, and in a very changing development finance landscape where certain types of development finance, such as for direct investment or development cooperation, sometimes I mean, fluctuate and concentrate in some developing areas rather than in others. So in order to discuss all these topics and issues, we have 3 speakers. So the first speaker is Anzetse, who will be joining us online. She's a senior economist. Hi. At Financial Sector Deepening Kenya, which is an organization working for a greener and digitally inclusive financial system. So thank you, Anzetse, for being with us today. And then we will, Farwa Sial is also joining us. She's a Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at EURODAD, you know, the European Network on Debt and Development. And then, last but not least, Diederick Zambon, Head of the Public Sector and Sovereign Operation Division for Sub-Saharan Africa at the European Investment Bank. So a multi-stakeholder panel in order to address this main challenge of development finance and its multiple trade-offs from all relevant angles. So let me start with a general question, and I will ask the 3 of you to be brief so we can have time to make 2 or 3 rounds of interventions, and also to have some time for Q&A. And given that most of us have a plane or a train to catch, so we will have to finish on time. I might start with you, Diederick. So how do you think the EU could more effectively work on African with African partners in order to address all the challenges related to the Russian war in Ukraine and the post-COVID situation, and at the same time including inclusive recovery and resilience through development finance?
Thank you, Iliana, and good afternoon to everybody. I think since yesterday, when we had the high-level opening session, and we have seen it on the various panels today as well, we always come back to finance. And indeed, the problem is scarcity, always to respond to everything what is needed. The more when we talk about a crisis, well, we have here the theme of the Russian war in Ukraine. We had COVID-19, but as we concluded yesterday already, there are many crises. There's the climate crisis, there's the security crisis, when we think, for instance, of the Sahel. And a crisis always requests 2 responses: an immediate response, which is partly a political response, but the people who go through a crisis, whether that's a cyclone or drought or a war, they need immediate support. There are many good organizations for that. We all know the Red Cross, we know the UN agencies, there's ECHO from EU. And then is the more sustainable long-term support to avoid crises or to repair the problems of crisis. There typically an organization like EIB and many other IFIs or many NGOs could come in. We do that partly with limited money available. And that's why we do not only need for the amount of the actions which are needed. We do not need organizations as ours, but we also need the private sector for that. How to do this? Well, a certain part is just giving a helping hand, but when we go on the more structural repairing and the structural preparation of avoiding of crisis, we need, of course, to work intensely with local partners. I can give you some examples of what we have done in the COVID context, where we have immediately responded with help of the EU of setting up guarantees to ensure that through the COVAX system, many of the African partners would have access to vaccinations. So that's a very, very immediate action. But we have set up many operations as well for countries to strengthen their health sector. For instance, Angola, we recently signed another loan, and we work there very closely with World Health Organization and the UN to make sure that there is a strengthened system of healthcare, so to the benefit of everybody. But one step further, when you go further, what we have seen for the healthcare in Africa, that Africa did not get the vaccinations which they needed, didn't get the medication they needed, because their supplier, Asia, was keeping a number of things for themselves. So I think finally, EU and African Union have come to the conclusion that this should end, this whole thing. So we need to have more vaccination than only, I think it was less than 1% of vaccination was produced in Senegal for yellow fever. The rest was all imported. So we set up with African Union, with the equivalent of the African form of World Health Organization and the EU, and financed by EIB, by IFC, by bilateral financiers. We set up systems to produce vaccination. Typical example, Senegal, where they have the Institut Pasteur since more than a century, which has a very good experience in healthcare and, vaccination and medication production, but as well with Rwanda and with South Africa. This is a plan for Africa. This is not everybody can do that. You need a value chain of healthcare. You need to have people who can do the research, who are sufficiently educated to bring this type of things forward, because vaccination is not just putting a number of things together and you have what you need. Vaccination is 3-star cooking. So not only the ingredients makes you a 3-star cook, and that's what you need for vaccination. So here a typical response of a crisis, how you have to work better together and as well with local partners. And it's not the financiers driving the show. We can do a lot. We can deliver technical assistance. We can do. We can deliver knowledge in certain elements because we have our engineers, etc. Also, but it is the country, or in this case as well, it can be what we call SPVs, special purpose vehicles, so private sector developers with support as well of the local countries taking an important part in the capital. So you get directly into quite advanced structures, but you have always to see what's the need, what's the market, and here as well, overcome as well internal national regulation, which very often forbids that one of the producers can simply export this type of vaccines or other medication to another country. So there was a very clear role of the African Union to play to make sure that there's the sufficient regulation which allows that those who are producing can indeed as well export it. I would leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. So a clear identification of national capacities and needs and also working better together. What would you add, Farwa?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, big thanks to ECDPM and all the organizers and the think tank group. It's a privilege to be here. And I couldn't attend yesterday, but today's conversations were really interesting. So I think in response to the points raised and in general, although we've heard a lot about the crisis and actually the paper on COVID done by you and authors is really presents a very good picture of the nature of crisis. I want to start with 4 facts which are really important. First is, of course, the debt distress. I'll get to that maybe later in depth, but we know that there is a big debt crisis in developing countries, especially in Africa. Second is the issue of vaccines. And I think we have to be very clear that there has been a very long, protracted process where developing countries, including African countries, have been asking for a vaccine waiver, so an IP waiver. And after, we're just in this period where vaccinations and boosters have happened. This is the 4th booster, I think, which is happening in developed countries now. And now there is some sort of a middle ground or a compromise in which EU actors are involved, and it's not a vaccine waiver or an IP waiver. It's actually a sort of compromise where developing countries now have access to compulsory licenses, which is very different to the very basic idea which is promoted by People's Vaccine, that everybody should be allowed to develop vaccine and benefit from it. So that's second. The third aspect, which is I think important to mention in this context, is the problem faced by Africa, which is food dependency and particularly wheat dependency. So African countries are almost 70 to 80% dependent on wheat, which they could not access. But we see widespread reports, especially in the beginning of this year, that African countries did not receive those exports coming from Ukraine, and majority of them were coming to rich countries. Now there is a 1 billion euro fund in which the EU is heavily involved. So it remains to be seen how effective that is in tackling that problem. Finally, there's the issue of migration, which is really important because, I think EU did a historic approach. Very, very unprecedented examples was set in welcoming Ukrainian refugees. Eurostar announced free passage, and really it is one of the most humane response ever, which we can expect. And the very idea of being a refugee is actually acknowledged. Still, that approach is not welcome to all countries. So it's not possible for all developing countries, including Africa. So this is the situation in which we need to understand the current crisis, the role of development finance, the role of aid, the role of concessional finance. And one thing which is really important to mention here is the nature of African integration into global financial markets. So I think a best way to describe is that Africa is integrated in the international financial architecture, but in adverse ways. That is, this inclusion has not been to the benefit of African countries. And this needs to be the start of any talk about global value chains, any talk about debt distress, any talk about trade or FDI. Because these are causal links. We talk about it, but we have to have concrete evidence on how this inclusion has been to Africa's benefit. So within this scenario, I think what a bigger picture here, as we were hearing a minute ago in stabilization, is that African problems, or when we talk about EU-Africa relations, is not simply to do with Africa. I mean, with climate change, with the question of debt, if you remember the 1970s, 80s crisis in which heavily indebted countries received a waiver, it has global impacts. So any conversation that we have on EU-Africa relations should be informed by the situation and by relations which are ongoing and have a historic impact.
Okay, cannot see you here. As I said, what would be your view on what the EU could be doing differently or better, or more efficiently?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the previous speakers. I am aligned with a lot of what they're saying. I think, first of all, context is crucial. And so just to point out that from the view of African economies, the most immediate flavor that I think that has maybe left a bit of a bad taste in the mouth of African governments has been alluded to, the COVID vaccine issue. So it's good to see some positive momentum on that. But I think it should be noted that the newly inaugurated Kenyan president, when he was elected, he was still saying we need vaccines. I think we can't delude ourselves into thinking that African governments have not noticed the dragging of feet on that. That is real, and that will inform, I think, tones going forward. I think the second big thing is sort of the way the Russia-Ukraine crisis again highlighted, meant very clearly to African governments that they could very quickly be deprioritized in the context of what's going on in Europe. And so while there is a real welcome and an appreciation that there's new momentum around the Africa-EU agenda, I think I would be just intellectually dishonest to say that there isn't some bad taste in the mouth that I think there will be a milieu that will be informing things going forward. So I think that's from the diplomatic point of view. I think from the economic point of view, it's already been fairly well articulated in terms of the economic impact of the Ukraine crisis. And I think beyond the food security issue, one of the things we're seeing is the impact it's having on our exports. Eastern Europe had become a key source of export, particularly for agricultural commodities and African countries that export agricultural commodities, but also for tourism. So we're beginning to really see the multivariate ways through which we're going to have direct fiscal implications on the Ukraine crisis beyond food security. Now, this leads to the debt issue that's already been alluded to. And so I just want to say that from the view of African governments, right now, the big macroeconomic tension that's being negotiated is that on one hand, you've got to ensure that fiscal survival happens and fiscal recovery happens, because it's absolutely correct that 19 of 30 low-income African countries are in debt distress or will be in debt distress. So fiscal recovery is top of mind for a lot of African governments. At the same time, the real economy has been facing austerity because of COVID and because of the Ukraine crisis. And so there's a deep need for a lot of economic recovery policies. Now, the reality is that the policies you need to survive fiscally are quite a tension with the policies you need to recover economically. Obviously, you need fiscal consolidation, you need to maybe restructure, schedule your debt, you need to dig for revenue, you need to limit spending in many ways in order to get to a point of fiscal strength. But if you want to recover economically, you need almost the opposite policies. You need deeper spending, you need to pull back on taxes, you need to provide support to households, particularly because of the food insecurity issues that have been alluded to. So I think it's very important to understand that from a policy perspective of African governments, they're already in a position where they'll be not necessarily in a position to effect the best policies, because they're looking at what a good policy here would mean on the other side of the economy. So I think there's a balancing act going on through which now development finance will be articulated. So I think on the development finance question, I wrote an article on this for British International Investment. I think there's a real opportunity, particularly if we're looking at anchoring in private sector capital, which does have an appetite but is risk averse, to start looking at the financial architecture of sustainable finance and actually start taking that quite seriously in order to allow African economies to anchor in and scale development finance. One of the things I've seen in the work that I do, because I'm a research practitioner and a policy advisor, is that when it comes to sustainable finance, there's a real lack of attention on the architecture of project origination, whatever project it is you're looking at in whichever sector, health, education, agriculture, whatever, manufacturing, originating those projects credibly, preparing those projects credibly, matching them, and then linking to the reporting and disclosure requirements that often come with development financing. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the inaugural green bond that happened in Kenya, which was through a private sector player, the origination and project preparation was through a nonprofit. It was our sister organization called FSD Africa that actually helped get that to market, and it wouldn't have gotten to market if that deliberate attitude had not been applied. And I think so if you're looking at the real work of scaling and dealing with the huge climate finance gap, et cetera, that we all know quite well, there's a real opportunity to really be quite deliberate in how particularly European development finance institutions interact with that architecture. And I think there's some real creativity that you can have where your aid organizations, and it's easy to do this, and there are already firms in Africa, even large banks in Africa, they can easily adapt to this, and I have the privilege of interacting with them, where you look at, maybe a GIZ or, a UK aid, or I know maybe UK aid is not the best example, but a GIZ sort of focuses on providing the subsidized funding to do the origination, to support the preparation, and to support the reporting and disclosure, because you cannot do that at a market rate, and DFIs are not going to touch that, and private sectors are going to touch that because it's expensive and nobody really knows what it costs. So there's a real opportunity to look at how can aid finance really subsidize that origination process, that preparation process, and the reporting process, and very quickly you can get a good sense of the amount of time and frankly money it takes to originate and prepare projects across the continent, because there are market intelligence firms, business advisory firms, banks that can do that quite well. And I think once that's sort of is subsidized with the aid side, then you can easily then feed that into the DFIs. And I think it's easy to do that on a country-to-country basis, where sort of GIZ interacts and sort of works with that model for KFW, et cetera, that sort of relationship. It's quite easy to then get proper project pipeline development, because one of the problems I've seen is that often the incubators, accelerators, whatever it is, it's sort of trying to do sustainable finance. It's like, who are you preparing these companies for? Who is the investor at the end, really? Because investors have very different flavors, particularities, expectations, and stakeholder requirements. So I think there's a real opportunity now, and I've been seeing an intellectual openness, which is really great, for aid and DFIs to be a bit more strategic in how they partner each other in order to scale that financing. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. You have all mentioned different topics that arose actually in yesterday's panel, and also the previous sessions on vaccines, research and productive capacities, food security, and also development needs in general terms, or development challenges, but also several topics related to different sources of potential development finance, or let's say of finance in the global south, such as financial architecture. Anzetse elaborated more on this, but also debt stress or even investment climate. So tracking, the different sources of external financing, what specific actions do you think could be undertaken in those specific fields? For instance, Farwa, related to debt and concessional finance, which are two flows that you mentioned in your previous intervention. What specific actions would you recommend?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I think, first of all, just to give you an overview of the debt situation in Africa, EURODAD, which is the African Network for Debt and Development, and one of our partner organizations, has done research and shows that 19 out of 35 low-income African countries are now in debt distress. And that's a huge part of the continent. And of course, the situation is global, not just Africa, but the cost would be extremely heavy on populations, on basic livelihoods, on the future of generations, because right now we're in a situation where we're talking about a long term, which is not visible in a very positive way. So the debt situation is extremely concerning. And on that front, I think the EU has a strong role to play, because once again, we have to remember that African countries and African leaders have been asking for debt cancellation. And what they have received so far is debt suspension. And yes, SDRs have been positive, but they're not enough. You know, we keep talking about the financing gap. And if you really want to fill the financing gap, this mythical gap, which is not being filled for a long time, and the SDGs are not being met, I think you can simply start by resetting the clock and moving towards debt cancellation, and then initiate a new dialogue, a new kind of setup in which we talk about the role of development finance and private sector instruments, for example. So that's one thing which is concerning. And the second thing which is happening mainly at the EU level is a reorientation of development aid and development finance. So previously, traditional development assistance did have a role for the private sector, but at the moment, this is so heavily featured that it's very hard to distinguish between the threshold which forms development finance or commercial finance. And actually, this is not an exaggeration, because if you look at certain instruments, so for example, the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, and which is now absorbed in the larger body of NDICI, a very big acronym, which is Neighborhood Development International Cooperation Instrument. As it was already mentioned, it is a lot of guarantees and a lot of room for blended finance. However, we are still not sure what the evidence is on the efficacy of blended finance. You know, we need impact, we need evidence on development additionality, and it's simply not there. The second feature, which is very, very prominent these days and which has been covered a lot, is the Global Gateway. So a 300 billion offer, and it's called a positive offer from the EU to countries around the world as a positive offer. But actually, if you look into the finances of the 300 billion, they are existing finances. So actually, this is not a fresh resource. There's no new money. And within that, only 18 billion are in grant. So actually, two things. One, that the 300 billion is being repackaged as something new, which is something which actually existed already. And secondly, the grant element is very less. So if we talk about crisis, if we talk about rehabilitation, which we were also listening to in the previous session when it comes to stabilization, what happens in a crisis? You need finances to move you towards stability. And those are concessional finances, those are aid, which then goes through instruments such as budget support and actually helps bring the country back to track. But at the moment, there is a very, very heavy orientation towards private sector, and it's not clear how the private sector will deliver and actually who will benefit in the end. So this is something which needs to be addressed at the EU level. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As you all know, and anyway, it's included in the briefing note. Remittances, migrants and remittances have become the single most relevant flow of external finance to the global south. Since your organization, Anzetse, is also dealing with micro entrepreneurship, what specific actions do you think could be undertaken in that particular field?
Thank you for the question. I think remittances, frankly, play two roles. One is relief to households in a context where incomes have been stagnant for a very long time. So I think you sort of have to bear that in mind. But the households they relieve is not often the poorest household. There is still a socioeconomic gradation that happens in terms of households that are getting access to diaspora remittances. So I think that is being modulated. I think the other big role that remittances play is a macroeconomic stabilization effect of forex earning that has been crucial in the context of the strengthening of the dollar, depreciation of currencies, and countries that are essentially import economies. So if you're talking about remittances in that sense, I think the first thing that would be useful is just cutting the cost of how much it costs to send money. I think Africans have said this and African governments have said this many, many times. There is a real need to get a lot of momentum around that so that we can deepen the scale of remittances that can be sent. We have been seeing a material deterioration. Even in Kenya, we've been seeing a material deterioration of the scale of remittances that are being sent because households in Europe are also having a very difficult time. This is not easy times for them either. And so what we're seeing is that there's been a decline in the remittances that are being sent to Africa because the socioeconomic conditions in Europe are beginning to deteriorate. As a result, this would be a really good and very useful time to cut the costs of remittances so that that can continue to happen. I think the other thing beyond remittances, I'm going to just talk about Forex because it is directly related to our fiscal situation. If we're talking about debt relief or any conversation about rescheduling, the reality is that the bulk of African debt now sits with private creditors who are not interested in any talk about relief. That's just not, in my view, something that they're interested in. And we're talking about both domestic creditors and external creditors. So if we're talking about a relief question, that will really be a sliver of the debt that will be dealt with. Yes, we know the IMF has been trying to get private creditors to the table, but it's a very difficult process, a very long process. And by the time that eventually happens, the cash flow crunch would have already matured in Africa. So if you're talking about this from a Forex point of view, the reality is that this is really the time to start dealing with the export quality and the export performance of African economies and supporting the vision that a lot of African governments have to diversify their economies. In economies like East Africa, where we do have very diversified economies and more sophisticated exports, we're not, the sort of single oil exports, single metal mineral fuel exports that we see in some of Western, Central, and even Southeastern Africa. We do very diversified export. They tend to be agricultural commodity heavy, but the reality is that the lack of engagement or the limited engagement on working particularly with exporters to deepen the penetration of their exports into source European markets is a fundamental constraint. So we did research on this with the Overseas Development Institute. I led it with Dirk, who I know quite well. And we actually looked at, we analyzed the exports that Kenya has to 7 key source markets. Europe was one of them. And you need to get to the level of detail of and understanding what is the country good at exporting, but more importantly, what does the market want? Where is demand increasing? Where is demand decreasing? So that at a trade level, because we're already going into trade negotiations. We had the EPA that's sort of fallen on its feet with countries like the US, countries like Kenya dealing with that. That's the sort of market intelligence that becomes very useful to start understanding, well, if we're actually going to create mutually beneficial trade deals that are new, fresh, and speak to real realities, that is information that would be useful. And it's quite specific information and it's not difficult to do. But I think that will really create an environment where then African policymakers have actionable intelligence through which they can just then focus their trade negotiations, but also their export efforts, saying that at least if you push, rubber sole shoes as opposed to leather shoes, that'll actually be bought in Germany, maybe not in Spain. That's the level of intelligence you need. And it's not difficult to do, as I said, that would then, really increase the Forex that's being earned, that would then address some of the fiscal strain and the debt strain that's been alluded to.
Thank you very much, Anzetse. So different ideas are related to debt, conceptual finance, remittances, debt again, and also the trade pattern and structure, including a better understanding and more detailed information on the features of all those flows. Diederick, what about foreign direct investment?
Yes, foreign direct investment and trade in general, two very, very important parts for development and partnership. And what we are going for is, of course, sustainable development. And how can you provide that by indeed private sector? For I agree that there's a part of the support is definitely needed from EU and other sides for providing sustainable development for the budget, for the states, etc. but it is, if we want or not, the private sector in every country. In Europe, it's exactly the same. In Africa, it's the same. It's the private sector which creates jobs, which creates wealth, which creates, with that, a fiscal basis for the government to do the necessary things which a government is supposed to do, being enabling a good economic development, good basis that people, that population can live and work in the best possible circumstances. And we have seen in the panel before, this is all about peace and security. Yeah, it all comes back to that. So when we come back to finance of trade and finance for direct investment, we touch really the basis of a sustainable development of the future. So what can one do? Indeed, support through banks, companies, or directly companies. You have to support as well the government to provide these enabling infrastructure, and as well the regulation to attract, for instance, foreign direct investment. For the moment, we go through a very difficult period. There's a lot of attention, of course, a lot of tension in Europe, and a lot of uncertainty, economic uncertainty. So there are a lot of traditional big investors going outside of Europe or outside of the more developed areas. They have their doubts to go to African countries. So to help them is to provide finance. Of course, we are always working on a non-commercial basis, and if possible on concessional basis. And on that basis, allow private sector to develop and to start to export. And there I fully agree with our colleague in Kenya. Export is extremely important, and we can influence the way how things are exported. I was last week in Zimbabwe, where we financed, as first after many years, banks to help private sector exporting fruits to Europe. Fruits which you can find here just in the shelf of Carrefour or Deleuze or Tesco. There is on this particular production, which was production of blueberries, there's a lot of comment on climate pollution, because traditionally these berries were flown in, so by air. Under pressure of the European consumer, there is now this type of products are transported by boat. It takes 28 days to go from the plant to our shelf. And here you see the win-win part of creating, in that case, we are financing there by setting up a new blueberry production plant, I mean, it's orchard. 800 people working. The transport's going to Europe in a in a very positive climate structure. This is, I think, one of the challenges which we have to overcome, and you can only work with trade as well if you can have a sustainable development, something which is acceptable for all sides of these two economies.
So one last question, Diederick, because I mean we went through the ends and the means and the particular sources of external finance, and now to the particular actors. What could or should, I mean, as part of the EIB, what could or should the DFIs and the MDBs do? I mean, what type of more specific actions could they undertake?
Yeah, well, first of all, work together. That's extremely important, to always work together and to not go for white elephants, but to support really what is making the difference. And we do not have one answer fitting all, because we have to be extremely, extremely flexible in the products, in so the type of intervention, and in making sure that there's every time an innovative approach. I think in the background paper it was mentioned the use of special drawing rights of the IMF, a trust fund created by the IMF, where indeed we are looking into how to develop debt to climate swaps. That's something completely new. We have to see how this fits in as well, the international needs in the concessionality as well. The poorest and the middle income countries, very often they have agreements with International Monetary Fund and IMF to get to better economic situation, and there is a need for concessionality, very often 35%. So it's this type of elements come all together in the special drawing rights element. And we have to do that from European side with our African partners as well. So there is nothing which should not be agreed and with that acceptable between the various partners. Very concretely, we are for the moment, and really these days, talking again to Rwanda, how in a part of the SDRs can be used for a swap to climates, adapt to climate swap with that country. Just an example, and very often when you have one example, you can have a lot of more, you can replicate it in other countries. Support with guarantees can sometimes be the solution for issues. I will not say it's always the solution. I fully agree with that, because very often an investor needs really money. But sometimes we have cases where you have smallholder farmers having access to guarantee to produce. Well, in Africa, very often we have twice or three times per year, you can have a production season. So smallholders very often don't have money to reinvest. So through a guarantee system, banks can provide them at the end of one season, provide them with money to acquire their seeds, acquire their fertilizer, and start a second season. And with that, come through traditional wrong patterns. Yeah. And I think that is the challenge for all of us. And we can only get further every time if we do that together.
So different tools for different problems and different needs, debt to climate swaps, guarantees. What else?
Yeah, so I think focusing on DFIs and MDBs, maybe we can just sort of separate them at first, because DFIs are specialized vehicles or instruments for promoting private finance or private sector in developing countries, whereas MDBs are more general. And I think both of them have a very important role in their own right. In fact, it could be complementary. Yeah, I mean, I'm not just here to say very critical things. I mean, I'm trying to generate a debate in terms of what's happening and what the narrative is. So in that sense, if you look at DFIs, actually, there are a few things which need attention. So in terms of sectoral allocation, research done by ODI actually shows that in 2020, 50% of collective European DFI investments went to the financial sector. And this means that actually the push is towards financial products, financialization, which moves away from this idea of productive and transformational investment. So I mean, I think I completely agree with you on you know, what kind of investments, guarantees for smallholders, investments in agriculture. But actually, we also have to remember that when we talk about the structural unevenness of Africa, along with other continents, there is a mismatch because the exports are commodity based largely, and the imports are heavy industry. So we have to be very careful when we talk about export-led models and what DFIs are funding. Of course, in this case, as ODI has shown, 50% of investment is in the financial sector. So, you know, we have to move away from that towards the productive sector and also think about exports, which in fact benefit African countries in the long term. And I think the point in FDI is very similar because, you know, there is no direct correlation between the amount of FDI you have in your economies and development. You know, there is no causal relationship. For FDI to be meaningful, for FDI to help an economy transform, it has to be absorbed. So if you're a country which is heavily skewed towards mining, that nature of FDI is not useful for you because it's completely going out. And in that sense, I think what DFIs can do also is, I know there is a big attempt for harmonization of standardization, and this needs to go further also in defining metrics, for example. So when the EDFI, for example, itself, which is the European Development Finance Institutions, and the umbrella organization itself says that there is no set definition of what job quality is. So yes, global value chains should be strengthened. EU should provide better offer in terms of more sustainable value chains, for example, or strengthening investments. But then if you don't have a definition of what a better job quality is, how do you move ahead? And finally, so I think it's sectoral allocation. It's the kind of investments you're doing, which is the quality of offer you're providing, which has to be superior. And finally, I think there has to be a standardization, a legal standardization of binding regulation. So at the moment, the OECD is very active in implementing or in actually establishing and then rolling out these private finance standards, which I think are very comprehensive, which are very good in spirit, but at the end of the day, they are voluntary. So, you know, in a world where we see that there's a lot of problems with investments gone wrong, with companies going rogue, what does this push towards multi-stakeholder standardization mean? So these should be regulated more effectively. Thanks.
Interesting. So, Anzetse, what role for DFIs and multilateral development banks?
Thank you. And I agree with your export point in terms of increasing sophistication, but that is very much a government policy play. And in my experience, it's been very difficult for external finance to have a material impact on that without a certain type of government action going on. But I agree. I think the real thing, and I agree, the sectoral allocation in terms of DFIs to the financial sector is for a reason. It's because the financial sector can absorb it. And the financial sector is meant to be the one that then deploys it. That's why my answer and my argument is that there is a need for the financial sector, particularly if you're looking at the subsidized lending that the African banking sector is getting to deepen green lending, to deepen SME lending, to deepen climate lending, to deepen lending to women. What tends to happen is that that financing is just then used to buffer high-risk segment that's already on the portfolio, and we're not seeing a scale on the recipient end. And this is a point that I think we've been making to bankers associations. The reason why that is happening is because the banking and the financial institutions are not getting the patient capital to actually do the origination, the preparation, and the reporting. So what ends up happening is all that subsidized funding from the IBs, et cetera, just go into their usual work stream and nothing different comes out on the other end. That's why I still argue that there is a need, particularly given the financial sector allocation, for there to be a shift in the intellectual mindset of DFIs and of the banking sector in terms of key performance indicators. Right now, if the KPIs are still going to be the number of loans you get, or et cetera, those usual KPIs of the banking sector, you're not going to be seeing the financial sector in Africa, which is sizable and which can have fairly deep roots, actually linked to the productive economy. That's not going to happen. So what you need to do, in my view, is have KPIs, and this needs to go all the way up to the governance level of the banks, both domestic and abroad, to decide that we need performance indicators around financial architecture linking to real economy and productive sectors. What projects are you originating at a sectoral level? What projects are you preparing at the sectoral level? And what support are you giving for reporting and disclosure? The African Guarantee Fund, in the conversation I just had a few weeks ago, actually said that if you're not going to subsidize us doing all this reporting and disclosure, we're not going to be able to do it, because each bank, each country has its own disclosure, its own. That is a lot of technical work, and that is not an expertise that these banking institutions have. They have very niche expertise. It's very specific. So again, I think the real opportunity we have here is for the DFIs to work with their sister organizations, their sister aid organizations, or to provide provisions in their own structures. That may be a bit more difficult. It may just be easier to do through the aid structures, where the mandate is to deepen project preparation and origination in real economy productive sectors that are priority sectors for the government and that have economic transformation potential. That way, then you can get all the subsidized lending that you're giving to the banks actually have that productive impact. Otherwise, we're just going to have the same story of, you know, giving money to banks and then nothing really happens in terms of the segments that it was targeting.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I will now open the floor to the audience, both physical and online audience. And yeah. Okay, so here, second row.
Yes, thank you so much. Very insightful discussion. My name is Stephanie Arnold. I'm from the University of Bologna in Italy. And I was just thinking, so we were talking about like a little bit of about internal revenue and how African countries are just struggling to come up with sufficient money to make ends meet. And we all know that like tariffs, import and export tariffs are like an important part of those revenues, whereas like taxes paid internally, both by private persons and businesses, are like a very small share in general. So what came to my mind is like the special economic zones that some of the countries now try to implement, in part copying like the Chinese model, for example. Like, do you see scope for that? Like, do you think it's a good strategy in going ahead, or do you think this is going to rip like governments from this like portion of tariffs that they're actually getting from imports and exports? Thank you.
Okay, so that was one question, and then, yeah.
Yes, I would like to come back on the role of the private sector for indirect investments in productive industries, exportable products. I try to convince Dutch, German, French, Belgian industrialists to invest in Africa, but all of them, they tell me, no, Africa is not secure, it's not stable, we are not going to invest over there. How to overcome that? On the other hand, I have been in Africa now, I have visited 7 different Sub-Saharan countries with a lot of stability already, but I feel it is interesting to go there and invest, but they do not know that. How to make our European investors know in productive industries that it's worthwhile to invest over there in those 10 or so Sub-Saharan countries with more or less stable institutions.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the discussion, but it's a very interesting discussion nonetheless. I wanted to ask your expert opinions on the possibility of kind of twinning and TAIEX programs, which we used to have with the former Eastern European countries, in terms of, you know, transfer of knowledge, transfer of know-how on a almost person-to-person basis, or at least on a smaller scale, because I've often been thinking that this is what Africa also would need, this kind of twinning and TAIEX projects, but I don't know if it exists, and I don't know what your opinion of this is. And then it also somehow comes back to private sector development in the African countries. And again, sorry if you already touched upon the subject. Thank you.
Can I? Mariela Dichomo from ECDPM. My question goes a bit back in how do you link the investment part with the policy and with the support technical support for investment, whether through TAIEX, technical assistance, and in other ways. These were essentially the three pillars of the European sustainable for the European external investment plan. But then, yeah, I wanted a comment on whether do you feel this still is a good approach, and if you have examples of how this has been brought forward now under the FSD Plus and other areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we already have 4 questions, so I think I'll give you the floor back to the panelists. So fiscal base, taxes and tariffs, FDI, private FDI, private investment in for productive industries, technological and know-how transfer, and the link between investment and technical support. Who wants to start? Okay.
Yes, I'm happy to start, and I'll touch on a number of points from my point of view, and I hope that my colleagues in this panel will take up the various points as well from their point of view. Special economic zones can be a very good system, because what you do then, you normally create a zone where you have dedicated enabling infrastructure. You have water, you have power, you arrange everything, that people are there, you have good production centers, you might have, well, you will ensure that what you have to export, which especially if you have to export to well, all European countries or to the States, you have to have certain quality forms. You can ensure that a lot better in this type of ring-fenced zones. So with some exceptions, we have seen in Ethiopia where China has set up economic zones which were, from human point of view, absolutely not acceptable. But in a number of African countries, we have seen very good economic zones. Keeping it out of the taxes, yes, that makes then sense, because with special economic zones, what you do as well in certain cases, you import raw materials, you use the factor production, so people, to make the transformation of the imported goods to something which is acceptable to export it. And on that basis, you create, again, jobs. So that is let's not underestimate the importance of the young amount of people in Africa, which is very often 1/3 to 50% under 25 or 30 years. So this is the challenge for every African government. Brings me to your question about how to convince people to invest, and that is, for a big part, in my view, linked to governance issues. And you see there very bad examples, but as well very good examples. I mean, a country like Rwanda, where there has been a lot of education, at least gives for investors the basis of educated people. And that's why certain things they can do. There is another element on Rwanda, which is the political element. I will not comment on that one, because that's another thing. But I mean, you see a number of countries. It depends as well on the sector. When we see Botswana, which has created a completely diamond cutting industry, which did not exist 10 years ago, and with help of, amongst other, India, amongst certain European countries. And when you see then that there is a good education of people, yes, why not? And it attracts those who want to produce something. The question of the twinning programs. I know that Germany is always very strong in this, to have twinning and training. And in fact, in Global Gateway, one of the focal points is as well to have openness of education. Yeah, the Erasmus program, but have the Erasmus Mundi. So promote that people from Africa, amongst others, and from other continents, can come and exchange to come to Europe, and vice versa. that there's a lot more knowledge, that there's a lot more knowledge sharing. So I think that's absolutely, well, the Erasmus is one of the most successful, if not the most successful program ever set up by the European Union. So I think that this is now put wider in the world is a very, very good thing. I'm not personally knowledgeable about real twinning systems, but I think this is indeed one of the things to bring our continents together. So it's very important, this human touch, but as well this intense basis of making that an economic basis for the future. And then we had the question of the combination of policy with technical assistance and investment. That remains normally for finance a very essential point. Again, point of departure is sustainable development. So for that, we need to have the general policy. Then you need to identify and prepare investments, and that you do normally with technical assistance. And as well, to once you start to finance, you have to make sure that the investments are being brought forward in the best possible way. And very often there's not always the knowledge available. So you give another part of technical assistance to help the promoters of such a project to implement projects in the best possible way. So I do think this is still a very, very actual and essential way of getting to the financing of operations.
Thank you.
My colleagues.
Thanks. I think I'll just speak a little bit about the technical assistance because maybe the other ones have already been addressed. So yeah, I think it's great to hear about the Erasmus program being part of Gateway and being more international because yes, it has worked very well for the EU. It's a very strong, cohesive force. So if given on similar grounds to developing countries, including Africa, I think that's a positive sign. But actually, I also want us to reconsider this idea of technical assistance. What is a technique that we're transferring, right? I mean, it could vary from sector to sector. It could be financial banking, for example. So let's say we're training civil servants to be better bankers or, have certain kind of expertise. And I think the question is, why don't they already have it? And if you look back in history and look at the period of 1990s or even 1980s, all these capacities were present in all these countries already. The innovation is not the domain of the EU or the US or the OECD. It's something which is cultivated. It's something which is capacity building. It's something which is a product of governance and an investment, which we're all talking about in terms of development finance. And then again, what are we trying to achieve with a certain kind of technical assistance? What are the goals? And I think ultimately the goals are self-sufficiency. In all the narrative that we have today is the idea that these countries should not be in a place where they need finances, external finances, for example. So I think this needs to be revived because technical assistance as a program has been given since a long time, it was a very active policy tool from a lot of OECD countries, and it's come with mixed bags. So in a way, when the program ends, I think there's nothing to show for it actually, because then there is no capacity for things to move forward. So it has to be a combination of ways, but also, I think there are many things that we can learn from African countries as well. And when we talk about true partnerships, I think we should also consider what can we learn from them in terms of agriculture, what can we learn from them actually in terms of sustainability. I mean, do we really need such expensive renewable investments, or are there solutions which are local, which are indigenous, which are already there? So this idea of partnerships and technical assistance could be very important. And finally, I think coming back to the point of technical assistance, I think, when you must already have seen it, when WHO was talking about the vaccine in the beginning, I think when we talk about technical assistance, when we talk about IP rights, when we talk about innovation, we need to imagine a world where WHO and all countries, no matter if they're developed or developing countries, come together to develop a shared vaccine that is an intellectual property which is owned by all countries equally. So in a sense, it's not simply about technical assistance, it's about property rights. And this is what needs to be addressed when we talk about capacity building. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Farwa. Anzetse, anything you would like to add on those four questions from the audience?
I'll just add on the revenue point. The revenue point is not one to be snubbed at. It's a serious issue. And I think there, you're seeing African governments deal with the reality of the scale of informality, because even if your GDP grows, your revenue to GDP doesn't. So I think an easy way to get to the bottom of that, if you want to do that exercise, to the lady who asked, look at different African economies, look at how they've been performing in terms of revenue to GDP, whether it's been going up and going down, look at the sources of that revenue. And then that will give you a sense of where actual credible revenue sources are. For a lot of African countries, our revenue to GDP has been deteriorating even as our GDP grows. So it's a fundamental constraint, and that is because of market access. So when I talk about exports, I'm not just talking about Forex. You cannot grow a private sector if there's no market and there's no demand. Yeah. So the two sorts of market is consumption, and then you've got the export markets. Consumption markets are fundamentally constrained by GDP per capita, fundamentally constrained by poverty levels, dependency ratios. These are all lived realities that inform consumption habits. That's why export markets are so important. And even as we try and restructure, and African governments are not foolish, they know that they need to sophisticate their exports. The reality is that we need to access those markets in order to generate forex, in order to generate income, so that our consumption can increase and you can get your fiscal kickback. These things are all interrelated. So that's on the revenue question. I think on the technical transfer, I'll just close on this. I mean, as much as people in the room may not want me to say this, but China does this really well. China does this really well in the public projects and in the private projects. And it's something that I assess. I am an Africa-China expert. If you look at the private sector, to the point that was made on what is the point of technical assistance, that is precisely the key question. What they do is that the technical assistance is specifically linked in private sector to improving productivity in the host firms, period. If you're not going to do technical assistance that improves the productivity of the staff that you're working on, there's really no use to do it. An ideological commitment to technical assistance doesn't really yield results if there's no real end goal to it. So I think on the private sector side, and you'll find that there's been no material difference, and I think it was SOAS who did this assessment. I did a whole piece on this for Sub-China. There's no difference in the scale of technical assistance that's provided by Chinese firms versus those that are provided by Europe and North American firms, language notwithstanding. So I think if you have very clear productivity goals at the end of it, and your source market is clear, then it becomes very easy to figure out what technical assistance works. I think if you're looking at the public projects, there you'll have to filter that through the political economy of job creation and youth upskilling, and you'll have to determine which, not only just the education base is in the population, and not just the size of the population, but the type of education they're getting. Because what we're finding is that even as the young people get educated and trained, the structural reality of economies means that the economy still can't absorb them. So if you want to really do technical assistance in a matter that is economically transformative, you've got to build out the manufacturing sector. And I think to the last point that the gentleman made on how to convince investors, my view is actually Africa is not for everybody. That's just the reality, it's not. And I think if you look at the composition of FDI into Africa, it's becoming pretty clear that China, Turkey, India, in private FDI, I'm not talking about government state-led projects, is beginning to overtake European players and North American players. And I think it's not just about governance or making it all about Africa. There's a fundamental intellectual approach that global South investors bring that global North investors do not have. And it's something to do with the familiarity with informality and economic proximity and understanding on how to get results in these environments. And I think that's something that the market will just become clear over time who Africa is really for.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Africa is not for everybody would be one of the conclusions of the seminar. Thank you so much to all of you. We've run out of time, so I think we will close this very interesting conversation here. Thank you so much to all three panelists for this very interesting conversation, and also the public for very useful and interesting questions. And I will now pass the floor to Guerre Laporte, Director of the GGG, who will provide all the answers for the future of the Europe-Africa relations.
I think everybody is very tired, so we are not going to take too much. And maybe there's even Belgians in this room, and Belgium is playing Croatia at this very moment. So that's a very, very important issue as well. But just a few pointers. Maybe the first preliminary observation is I think many people were very happy to meet physically. I heard this so many times during the breaks. It's wonderful to see each other back again, because we only have seen each other virtually in the past 2 years, 2.5 years. And this was definitely yesterday evening and also today a very nice observation by many people. I have 5 takeaways, but they are extremely selective. They are extremely limited because we still have to work on a report at a later moment. And of course, we have taken more note than the 5 points that I will raise, but they are just teasers. The first one is that many people said that the temperature of the Europe-Africa relationship at this very moment is quite low. Frustrations have been accentuated by, of course, COVID and Ukraine. But what I also felt, particularly yesterday evening, but also today in many of the sessions, is that we are reaching a point where there is more openness to have more frank dialogue. The crises that we mentioned have accentuated a whole range of underlying tensions, frustrations about the behavior of both partners in this partnership. But that's not too bad. These elements have really come to the forefront, and we are now entering a stage where there is, in my view, more perspective for frank dialogue. I think we have a frank dialogue that possibly also puts into question some of the good news show that we are used to produce in all types of statements, public declarations, every time when there is a summit, every time when there is an important meeting. We tend to always say this is the best partnership in the world that you can find. No, we should be realistic. We should demystify this a bit. And with this crisis, this demystification has started, and it is not bad. I think it's a good sign that we are recognizing each other's weaknesses and each other's elements that could improve in this partnership. And of course, we also see that the balance of power is changing. We see a stronger African bargaining power, and this also leads to different African positioning in the global arena and in the relationship with Europe. So I think to some extent we are ending a stage that might be a promising future perspective for the future. But of course, we have to learn with this more open type of dialogue. And I see that sometimes the EU is still at unease, and I guess Africa as well, particularly with the growing assertiveness. We are not used to have that assertiveness as Europeans, as European institutions. And of course, many of the African states at a certain moment might have disappointed the European side, particularly on this Ukraine issue. But we have put all the arguments on the table. African states did not want to be pressurized to pick up a certain side or to pick a side in the partnership, in the situation of Ukraine. They wanted to avoid being caught in a Cold War. They wanted to keep their options open. But on the other hand, we've also seen that Ukraine, of course, is a sovereign state that has been invaded. And it is for some quite surprising that the African Union principle of territorial integrity has not led to a firm condemnation of Russia by some of the African states. And this was also a point that was also made by some of the Africans here in this meeting room. So the last word has not yet been said, but I think the dialogue will become more open, will become more frank. That's the first point. The second point, I think if we look at the diagnosis of the problems in the partnership and the big challenges on how COVID and Ukraine have affected the Europe-Africa partnership, I think there's quite some consensus on the diagnosis. We repeated it several times today, the problems of food security, rising energy, food prices, the historic levels of drought, hunger crisis, humanitarian disasters, major economic impacts of COVID and Ukraine on exports, agricultural commodities, growing problems of instability, worrying trends of unconstitutional changes of government in parts of Africa. All this is, I think, accepted by both parties. We are in agreement on the problems that have been identified, and I think our discussions have highlighted this very much. What I think we learned from the discussion is that it are particularly the lowest income countries, the most vulnerable countries that, as always, are the biggest victims of the food crisis, the biggest victims of the climate crisis. There are many losers. We also learned this morning when we talked about food that there is also a few winners, a few people who are also making big profits of this crisis. But on the diagnosis, I think there is a kind of consensus. But when we then go to remedies, how do we remedy all this? There you see a whole range of policy measures and instruments that have been highlighted in the past hours. We have talked about a whole range of policies, regional policies that should be strengthened, development of sustainable agriculture, diversification, stop with the fossil fuels, invest in renewables, the massive opportunities to invest in renewables. Lots of things have been said about what should be done. That's my third point. But the question, of course, that we all have on our mind is the fourth point. How are we going to do this? What are the elements that we should take into account to really make all these nice proposals to remedy the situation, to make these work? And there I would think that there's a few elements that struck my attention. When we talk about how, we should carefully manage the transition process and build bridges between different positions of both continents, and also look, of course, at the dimensions of time. And the first element that I would like to mention is the gap between short-term and long-term measures. An example, everybody agrees that the world, Europe and Africa, have to move from fossil fuels in the longer term, but in the short term, Africa has a number of priorities. It wants to industrialize, it would like to cash in on its fossil fuels. So we should always look into account how this longer term perspective on which we all agree can be bridged with the short term demands, where there is absolutely a need in many African countries to take measures at this very moment that are beneficial to their own economies. And bridging that gap between short-term and long-term is absolutely essential. A second element amongst the how questions in managing the transition that I keep in mind after this discussion is the joint responsibility. Both Africa and Europe have real clear responsibilities in this whole transition process. And we know a bit what these responsibilities are, and many things have been said. The European Union could adapt its support better, it could do better debt cancellation, it could support regional approaches. Lots of things have been said, but also Africa, and I think that was interesting when we discussed food security, also Africa has a number of responsibilities to take forward. What I remember, for example, is that some people were quite critical of the Agenda 2063. They said, look, this agenda is always brought to the attention of everyone in every public meeting, but can we wait until 2063 with this agenda? Shouldn't we move a little bit faster in terms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, in terms of for example, spending more on agriculture. Only 4 African countries have spent 10% of their budgets on agriculture at this very moment, while there was a commitment taken in Maputo several years ago to do so. So I think this is quite an important element. The joint responsibility is stressed by many of the people here in this meeting room, and I hope that the policy-making world will also take account of these, while also and always recognizing that at the end of the day, it is the African side that needs to give its strategic direction. So the demand-driven agenda remains extremely important. When we talk about how, an element that, of course, also comes back all the time in many of the sessions are the means, the resources, the financial means. And also there, I think we should break with a kind of quote that is one of my preferred quotes. It has not been said here, but it illustrates a little bit how our discussions in Europe and Africa, or between Europe and Africa, always have been led in the past. It was mentioned to me by a former Director General of the European Commission. We finance what you ask us, provided that you ask us what we want to finance. This is not what I would call particularly demand-driven, but this is an element that comes up. We see also that there is a whole range of instruments. Many of these have been discussed. And I saw quite some divisions in this meeting room, in the different panels, between those who are attaching primary attention to the financing issue and who said it's about money, money, money. And then others who said, no, 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 it's not about money alone. We should also find ways to deal with a whole range of other issues. Smart policies was mentioned. Someone also said there is no vaccine for food security. One could also say there is no vaccine for conflict. At the end of the day, it is not money that will solve everything. It is an important element, but if you want to transform, if you want to bring about change, smart policies are essential, and these smart policies need to be targeted to the regions and the countries, because we also learned that there's a lot of country specificity amongst the 2 groups of countries which are dealing with each other. We don't talk about monolithic types of countries. And my last point, in fact, my 5th point, and that's the point that I was happy to hear, particularly in the panel on peace and security and governance. It was clearly said, don't skip this governance agenda. Bring the value agenda back. And I think Ola said it quite a few times. Bring the value agenda back into the discussion. If you want to solve food security issues, if you want to have better energy access, if you want to have a stronger role of Africa in the multilateral system, you always will have to refer to some extent to the governance dimension. And let this now be the dimension that in the partnership has been quite neglected in recent years for different reasons. Europe was very much concerned with its global gateway. It was very much concerned with, to some extent, copying what others are doing in Africa. Global gateway for me is sometimes a bit a copy of the Belt and Road Initiative. But we tend to forget that there is a whole governance dimension that should also be given attention, but it should be given attention in a very different way than the way it has been promoted in the past. It means with much more modesty, recognizing as well that there's many problems in Europe as well in terms of governance, not to mention certain European countries where the governance situation has definitely deteriorated, but also avoiding prescription and patronizing attitudes, aid conditionalities, double standards. These type of things are not going to convince the other side if we want to bring up again the governance agenda. But governance remains absolutely essential. And then my last point is, at the end of the day, we should learn, or we should give up the ambition as Europeans that we can transform Africa the way we would like it to see, as a copy of our own society. I think at the end of the day, we should accept the divergences, and the way We also deal with China and the way we deal with Turkey on refugee deals and so on. We should also accept this in the relationship with Africa, that there is a different type of perspective on a whole range of issues, and then we have to negotiate. And it's a matter of negotiating, not negotiating from the traditional way in which this has been done in the past, a North-South relationship, which always creates a certain level of dependency, because one party funding another party, this is not what I would call equal partnership. So we should find ways to negotiate our divergences between both continents. And then I think we definitely might have some promising future together as Europe and Africa. With this, I would like to call on all of our member institutes and really thank our member institutes for all the work that they have put in this. We are 6 members, ETTG, Elcano in Madrid, IDRI in Paris, IDOS in Bonn, ODI in London, EIE in Rome, and ECDPM in Maastricht and Brussels. So these 6 institutes have contributed to the organization of this event with the different background papers. You received them relatively late in the process, but they are really worth reading thoroughly. Please take the time to do so. And of course, I also would like to thank my colleagues of the Secretariat who have been doing a fantastic job. They're standing there in the back. Maria Brozu and Daniele Fatibene. Maria Brozu, her last working day. Tomorrow she will leave us. We deeply regret that, but she has been extremely helpful in organizing this. And thank you so much, of course, for being here with us this 1.5 days. And also, of course, UNDP and the Swedish permanent representation with whom we had a fantastic cooperation in organizing this. Thanks a lot and have a safe return home.